Story number 1. The Thing That Followed from Buck Mountain. Jake Mercer had been hauling timber through the Appalachian Backroads for 17 years, and he thought he'd seen everything these mountains had to offer. On October 14, 2019, he picked up a load of hardwood from a mill outside Elkins, West Virginia, scheduled for delivery to a furniture plant in Asheville by dawn. The route took him through some of the most isolated stretches of the Monongahela National Forest, where cell service disappeared and the CB radio became your only lifeline. Around 2 a.m., Jake was navigating a particularly narrow section of Route 250 when his headlights caught something standing at the edge of the tree line. It looked human at first glance, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. The figure stood at least 7 feet tall, with arms that hung too low, almost reaching its knees. Its skin, illuminated briefly in his high beams, appeared pale and slick like wet clay. Jake's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he accelerated past, telling himself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a bear standing upright. But then he saw it again, 3 miles down the road. The exact same figure in the exact same posture, standing at the forest's edge. His heart began hammering against his ribs. There was no way anyone could have traveled that distance through the dense mountain forest in just minutes. He grabbed his CB radio, hands trembling, but got only static. The digital clock on his dashboard flickered, the numbers scrambling into meaningless symbols before returning to normal. For the next 45 minutes, Jake saw the figure 17 more times. Always the same distance from the road, always in that identical stance, watching. Each sighting sent fresh waves of cold terror through his body. He pushed his rig faster than he should have on those treacherous curves, the trailer swaying dangerously behind him. His CB remained dead, and his cell phone showed no signal. The mountains had swallowed him whole, and whatever that thing was, it kept pace effortlessly. The 23rd sighting was different. The figure stood in the middle of the road, directly in his path, forcing Jake to slam on his brakes. The rig jackknifed, tires screaming, and came to a violent stop just feet from the creature. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared through his windshield at the thing illuminated in his headlights. Its face was smooth, featureless except for 2 dark pits where eyes should be and a vertical slit for a mouth. It tilted its head slowly, studying him with an intelligence that made his skin crawl. Then it smiled. The slit widened, revealing rows of needle-thin teeth that seemed to go back impossibly far into its throat. Jake's bladder nearly gave out. He threw the transmission into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. Every electrical system in the cab shut down simultaneously. Lights, radio, ignition, everything. He sat in absolute darkness, hearing only his own panicked breathing and something else. A wet, dragging sound approaching the driver's side door. A hand pressed against his window. The fingers were too long, with too many joints, and they left smears of something dark and viscous on the glass. Jake could smell it now, a putrid combination of rotting vegetation and spoiled meat that made him gag. The thing's face appeared at the window, those hollow eyes staring directly into his soul. When it spoke, the voice came from inside the cab, inside his own head. "You drove through my hunting ground. Now you're marked." The electrical system suddenly roared back to life. The creature was gone. Jake didn't hesitate. He straightened the rig and drove like hell was chasing him, which perhaps it was. He didn't stop until he reached the furniture plant in Asheville, arriving 4 hours late with no memory of the last 100 miles of driving. Jake quit long-haul trucking the following week, but the promise the creature made wasn't empty. Every few months he sees it. Sometimes standing at the end of his driveway at night, sometimes reflected in his bathroom mirror standing behind him, sometimes sitting in his back seat when he glances in the rear view while driving to his new job in town. It never approaches closer, never does anything but watch and smile that terrible smile. Jake's wife left him after he started screaming in his sleep, shouting about the thing with no face. His therapist thinks it's PTSD, but Jake knows better. He drove through something's territory that October night, and now he belongs to it. The creature is patient, content to wait and watch, reminding him that someday when it's ready, it will collect what it's owed. Story the 2. The Voices in Hellbender Hollow. Sarah Chen moved to a remote cabin outside Marion, Virginia, in March 2021. Desperate for silence after years of working as an emergency dispatcher in Richmond. The property sat deep in Hellbender Hollow, a valley so named for the giant salamanders in its creek. Her nearest neighbor lived 7 miles away. The real estate agent mentioned the previous owner had left suddenly, abandoning most of his belongings, but Sarah assumed it was typical rural drama. The isolation was exactly what she needed, or so she thought. The first week passed peacefully. Sarah spent her days reading, hiking the property's 73 acres, and enjoying the absolute quiet. But on her 8th night, she woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of voices outside her cabin. Multiple people seemed to be having a conversation just beyond her bedroom window, their words muffled but urgent. She grabbed her phone and flashlight, heart pounding, and peered through the curtains. Nothing. The forest stood empty and still. When she pressed her ear to the window, the voices stopped immediately. She convinced herself she'd been dreaming, but the next night, they returned. This time, she clearly heard her own name mixed into the incomprehensible conversation. Sarah, spoken in different tones and inflections, some questioning, some accusatory. She called out, demanding to know who was there, and the voices erupted into laughter. Not joyful laughter, but mocking, cruel sounds that made her blood run cold. When she threw open her front door, shotgun in hand, the laughter cut off instantly. The forest was silent as a tomb. On the 4th night, Sarah decided to record the voices. She set up her phone on the windowsill before bed, recording continuously. At 3:07 a.m., she woke to the voices again, louder and more distinct. They were discussing her. "She's listening now," one said. "Should we show her?" another asked. "Not yet, let her wonder," a third responded. Sarah lay frozen in terror, unable to move or cry out. The conversation continued for 47 minutes, debating what they should do with her, describing her daily routines in disturbing detail, mentioning things they shouldn't know, her dead mother's name, her childhood address, her recurring nightmares. When morning came, Sarah checked her phone recording with shaking hands. The audio showed only silence and occasional sounds of the wind. 47 minutes of her lying awake in horror, hearing those voices, but the phone captured nothing. She nearly packed and left that day, but something stopped her. A stubborn refusal to be driven from her own home by some unexplained phenomenon. That night, she didn't wait for 3 a.m. At midnight, she walked into the forest with a lantern, following the direction the voices seemed to come from. She found a small clearing about 200 yards from her cabin. In the center stood a ring of 13 stones, each carved with symbols she didn't recognize. The ground inside the circle was bare dirt, nothing growing there, and the soil felt warm to the touch despite the cool spring night. The voices started immediately, surrounding her, coming from everywhere and nowhere, but now she could finally see their source. The air itself seemed to ripple and shimmer inside the stone circle like heat waves, and within those distortions she glimpsed faces, dozens of them, transparent and anguished, mouths moving in silent screams or hateful shouts. The voices grew deafening. You found us, now you see us, now you're one of us." Sarah ran, crashing through underbrush. Her lantern dropped and forgotten. The voices followed, chasing her through the forest, laughing and calling her name. She burst through her cabin door and locked it, knowing logically that locks meant nothing to whatever these things were. The voices pressed against the windows, against the walls, the door, trying to push inside. "Let us in, Sarah. We just want to talk. We've been so lonely since the last one left." She understood then why the previous owner had fled, leaving everything behind. But Sarah made a different choice. She grabbed sage, salt, and every protective charm her grandmother had taught her about, things she'd once dismissed as superstition. She burned the sage in every room, poured salt lines across every threshold, spoke prayers in Mandarin that her grandmother swore could ward off evil spirits. The voices raged and howled, but they couldn't enter. By dawn, silence had returned. Sarah investigated the stone circle in daylight, taking photographs and collecting samples of the carved stones. Her research revealed that the symbols were old Appalachian hex signs, but inverted, meant to trap rather than protect. Someone long ago had bound something in that clearing, bound many things, spirits, entities, whatever they were, and they'd been calling out ever since, trying to lure people close enough to... What? She didn't want to know. Sarah still lives in that cabin. She strengthens her protections monthly, maintains her salt lines, and never goes into the forest after dark. The voices still come at 3 a.m. every single night without fail, but they can't reach her anymore. She hears them arguing out there, planning, waiting for her to slip up just once. Sometimes new voices join them, and she wonders whose they are, where they came from, how many people these mountains have claimed. She sleeps with her grandmother's protective talisman under her pillow and knows that her isolation came with a price: eternal vigilance against the hungry dark. Story number 3, The Road That Moved. Tom Bradshaw and his son Ethan were driving back from a camping trip in the Cherokee National Forest on August 22, 2018. The route from their campsite near Tellico Plains, Tennessee to their home in Knoxville should have taken about 2 hours on Highway 68. Tom had driven this road dozens of times, knew every curve and landmark. Ethan, 16 years old, dozed in the passenger seat as afternoon faded into evening. Everything was routine until Tom noticed he'd been driving for 3 hours and nothing looked familiar. The highway markers still read 68, but the landscape had changed subtly. The mountains seemed taller, more oppressive, pressing closer to the road. Tom hadn't seen another car in over an hour, which was unusual even for this rural route. His GPS showed a blinking dot on a blank screen, the map data simply gone. Cell service had disappeared miles back. Ethan woke up, immediately sensing his father's tension. "Where are we?" he asked. Tom couldn't answer. They passed a road sign. Knoxville, 45 miles. 10 minutes later, another sign. Knoxville, 52 miles. The distance was increasing the closer they drove. Tom's mouth went dry. He pushed the accelerator harder, watching the speedometer climb to 70, then 80. The tree line blurred past. Another sign appeared. Knoxville, 67 miles. Ethan's breathing quickened. "Dad, what's happening?" Tom had no explanation to offer. The sun should have set by now, but it hung frozen at the same position above the mountains, casting long shadows that didn't move. Time itself seemed broken. Tom's dashboard clock blinked repeatedly, cycling through random times. 6:47 p.m., 3:22 a.m., 11:15 a.m., 9:03 p.m., never settling. His fuel gauge showed 3/4 full despite having driven for over 4 hours since their last fill-up. The laws of physics were negotiable here, apparently, and that thought terrified him more than anything. They crested a hill and Tom slammed on the brakes. Ahead, Highway 68 split into 3 identical roads, each with a sign reading Knoxville and pointing forward. 3 versions of the same highway diverging into 3 different valleys, each looking subtly wrong. The road's asphalt shimmered like a mirage. Tom chose the middle path because he had to choose something. They drove for another hour and the road split again, this time into 5 paths. Ethan started crying, pressing his face against the window. "I want to go home," he whispered. Tom fought down his own panic, gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He picked another path at random. The highway carried them through a tunnel he didn't remember ever existing, a long passage carved through solid rock. When they emerged, everything had changed completely. The landscape was wrong. Mountains that shouldn't exist. A blood-red sky, vegetation that looked almost but not quite like normal trees. Strange birds with too many wings circled overhead. Tom realized with sickening clarity that they'd driven somewhere else, somewhere that existed alongside their world but wasn't part of it. The road had taken them deeper with every turn, and now they might be impossibly far from home. Desperation forced Tom to act against all logic. At the next intersection, this time 7 identical roads, he threw the gear into reverse and began driving backward down the highway. Ethan stared at him like he'd lost his mind, but Tom remembered something his grandfather once said about Cherokee legends. If the mountain spirits lead you astray, retrace every step exactly, even if it seems like madness. He drove in reverse at 40 miles per hour, watching the impossible landscape scroll past through his mirrors. The highway resisted. The road seemed to shift beneath his tires, trying to turn them around, to keep them moving forward into deeper strangeness. Tom fought the steering wheel, staying straight, his leg cramping from holding the accelerator. Ethan gripped the oh shit handle above his door, praying under his breath. They reversed through the tunnel, backward through intersections, past signs counting up to impossible distances. Tom's arms screamed with fatigue, but he didn't stop. After 2 hours of reverse driving, the landscape suddenly snapped back to normal. The sun completed its setting in a rush, darkness falling naturally. Highway 68 became just a regular road again, and ahead Tom saw the blessed glow of a gas station. He pulled in, shifted into park, and sat, trembling, his whole body shaking with adrenaline come down. They'd been gone for 9 hours total, but when Ethan checked his phone, now showing full signal, only 20 minutes had passed since they'd left the campsite. Tom filled the tank, used the bathroom, bought sodas they didn't need, anything to confirm they were back in the real world. The gas station attendant gave them directions to Knoxville, looking at them strangely when Tom asked if Highway 68 was safe tonight. "Safe as any road," the man said with a shrug. Tom and Ethan drove home in silence, taking Interstate 75 instead, the long way, the way that stayed far from those mountains. Neither of them have been camping since. Tom sold all their gear, refused to explain why to his wife beyond saying there'd been complications. Ethan still has nightmares about those splitting roads, about paths leading deeper into impossible territories. Sometimes, late at night, Tom studies maps of the Cherokee National Forest, noticing how certain roads seem to shift position between different editions, how some marked highways can't be verified by satellite imagery, how there are spaces in those mountains that seem to exist in multiple places at once. He warns other drivers now whenever he gets the chance, though most think he's crazy. Stick to the interstates and the Appalachians, he tells them. Some of those back roads go places you can't come back from, and if the highway starts feeling wrong, don't keep driving forward. You might end up somewhere the maps don't show, somewhere that's been waiting a very long time for travelers to feed. Story number 4. The repeating hour at Blackwater Station. Miranda Lawson worked the night shift at a gas station outside Wise, Virginia, a job she'd held for 6 months since dropping out of college. Blackwater Station served the few travelers who still used Route 23 instead of the newer highway. On November 3, 2020, Miranda arrived at 10 p.m. for her usual midnight to 6 shift, relieving Dale, the evening guy. He looked exhausted, muttering something about a weird night before practically running to his car. Miranda shrugged it off. Dale was always dramatic. The first hour passed normally. A few customers came through for gas, cigarettes, and energy drinks. Miranda restocked shelves, cleaned the coffee station, and scrolled through her phone during the quiet stretches. At 11:47 p.m., a trucker came in, bought a sandwich and Mountain Dew, complained about his dispatcher, and left. Miranda glanced at the clock. 11:58 p.m., 2 minutes until midnight. She started the closing checklist for the register, preparing to mark the day's end in the log. The clock hit midnight. The fluorescent lights flickered. When Miranda looked up from the register, the trucker was walking in again, moving toward the sandwich cooler. She blinked in confusion. She'd just watched him leave, seen his rig pull out of the parking lot. But here he was, grabbing the exact same sandwich, the same Mountain Dew, approaching the counter with the same tired expression. He complained about his dispatcher using the exact same words, paid with the exact same crumpled $20 bill, and left. Miranda's hands trembled as she gave him change. She checked the clock. 11:58 p.m. That was impossible. She'd just lived through those 2 minutes. Her heart began racing. She told herself she must have misread the clock before, been distracted, lost track of time. But deep down, she knew what she'd seen. At midnight, the lights flickered again, and the trucker walked through the door once more, heading straight for the sandwiches. This time, Miranda tried to stop him. "Sir, you were just here," she called out. He looked at her with blank confusion, said, "First time tonight, miss," and continued to the cooler. Same sandwich, same Mountain Dew, same complaints, same $20 bill. When he left and she checked the clock, it read 11:58 p.m. The hour was repeating. She was trapped in the same 2 minutes, living them over and over. By the 20th repetition, Miranda was sobbing, screaming at the trucker when he walked in, begging him to remember, to acknowledge the loop. He looked at her like she was insane, completed his purchase exactly as before, and left. The clock reset. The lights flickered. He walked in again. Miranda tried leaving the store, but when she pushed through the door, she found herself back behind the counter instantly, the trucker entering as always. There was no escape from the building, no way to break the sequence. She tried everything. She refused to serve him. He left anyway, and the loop reset. She unplugged the clock. It kept running on no power. She threw the sandwich he wanted into the trash before he could buy it. He bought a different sandwich instead, but the loop continued. She locked the door. He was somehow already inside. The universe insisted on this transaction, this moment replaying endlessly while Miranda's sanity frayed. Around the 100th repetition, she noticed something new. In the parking lot, barely visible through the window, a dark figure stood at the edge of the light. Tall and impossibly thin, it watched the store with patient intensity. Each time the loop reset, it moved slightly closer. By the 200th repetition, it stood just outside the door, a vague humanoid shadow with eyes that reflected the fluorescent lights like an animal's. Miranda realized with horror that the loop wasn't random. Something was keeping her here, feeding on this repeated moment, on her growing terror and desperation. The trucker meant nothing to it. He was just part of the pattern, an innocent element in the trap. Miranda was the prey. Each loop, the figure drained something from her. She could feel it, a growing emptiness inside, like her life force was being siphoned away 2 minutes at a time. How many loops had passed? 500? 1,000? Subjectively, she'd been trapped for hours, perhaps days, while objectively only 2 minutes repeated endlessly. She tried to warn the trucker about the creature, pointing frantically at the window, but he never saw it, never believed her increasingly hysterical warnings. The figure pressed against the glass now, its face inches from hers, grinning with teeth like shattered glass. It raised one elongated finger to where lips should be, gesturing for silence, for acceptance. Miranda felt herself weakening, becoming translucent, less real with each repetition. Then she remembered something her grandmother taught her about Appalachian witchcraft. Patterns can be broken with blood and will. At 11:58 p.m., as the trucker approached the counter, Miranda grabbed a box cutter from beneath the register and sliced her palm open, gasping at the pain. She slammed her bleeding hand onto the counter, breaking the pattern with violence and sacrifice, shouting every protective prayer she could remember. The clock jolted forward, 12:01 a.m., 12:02 a.m., 12:03 a.m. Time began flowing again. The trucker stumbled, looking confused, leaving without completing his purchase. The figure outside shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and vanished into the darkness. Miranda collapsed behind the counter, clutching her bleeding hand, weeping with relief and exhaustion. She'd lost subjective hours of her life, maybe days, but she was free. When Dale arrived for the morning shift, he found Miranda curled up behind the counter, her hand wrapped in paper towels, staring blankly ahead. She quit immediately, refusing to explain beyond saying the station was wrong. The next night, clerk lasted 3 shifts before he also quit, reporting strange time anomalies. The station closed permanently 2 months later after 4 more employees reported similar experiences. Miranda still feels those lost hours sometimes, holes in her memory where the loops existed. She avoids working nights, refuses jobs in isolated locations, and keeps a knife within reach always. Sometimes she dreams of the trucker, endlessly buying his sandwich, trapped in his own loop, never knowing he's repeating forever. And sometimes, in reflections or photographs, she sees the figure standing just behind her, still watching, still waiting, hoping she'll be careless enough to fall into pattern again. Into a moment it can stretch into eternity while it feeds on her trapped soul. Story number 5. The Children of Cutter's Gorge. Paul Davidson's job was simple: maintain the fire watch tower in the Pisgah National Forest near Cutter's Gorge, North Carolina. At 63 years old, recently widowed, Paul welcomed the isolation. The tower stood 12 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by a rough hiking trail. He spent 2 weeks alone per shift, watching for smoke, reading, and enjoying the silence. In his 3 years at this post, he'd never had trouble. That changed on June 15, 2017. Paul first heard the children on his 4th day of a shift. Their laughter drifted up from the forest below the tower, high and musical, clearly the sounds of kids playing. He scanned the tree line with his binoculars but saw nothing. Strange, the trail was difficult and families rarely hiked this deep. The laughter continued intermittently throughout the afternoon, always moving, never close enough to spot. By evening it had stopped. The next morning Paul found small footprints circling his tower. Bare feet, child-sized, dozens of them pressed into the soft earth. They approached from the forest, circled the tower's support legs multiple times, then retreated back into the trees. Paul's skin prickled. Something about those prints felt wrong. They were too perfect, too uniform, like they'd all been made by the same foot pressed down repeatedly. He photographed them and tried his radio, but as often happened in this gorge, he got only static. That night, the children returned. Paul woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of them singing, a haunting melody with words he couldn't understand. The voices came from directly beneath his tower, and when he looked down through the trapdoor, he saw them. 17 children ranging from perhaps 5 to 12 years old, all holding hands in a circle around his tower, all looking up at him with identical expressions of desperate hunger. Their clothes were old-fashioned, decades out of style, and in the moonlight their skin seemed to glow with a pale, sickly luminescence. "Mister, we're lost," one little girl called up. "Can you help us find our way home?" Her voice sounded wrong, like multiple voices layered together, echoing. Paul's instincts screamed danger. These weren't normal children. He'd heard stories about Cutter's Gorge, how a bus full of school children had gone over the cliffside in 1952, killing everyone aboard, how their bodies had never been properly recovered from the ravine. He'd dismissed those tales as local legend. "Go away!" Paul shouted down, his voice cracking. "You need to leave!" The children's expressions shifted in unison, their faces twisting into masks of rage and grief. They began climbing. Their movements were all wrong. Fingers digging into metal like it was soft clay, bodies contorting at impossible angles to scale the tower's support beams. Paul slammed the trapdoor shut and piled equipment on top, but he could hear them ascending, scraping and scratching, whispering his name, though he'd never told them it. They reached his cabin and pressed against the windows, leaving smeared handprints on the glass, their faces pushed flat against the panes like creatures in a specimen jar. "Let us in," they chanted. "We're so cold. We've been cold since 1952. We just want to get warm." Their breath fogged the windows, and in each fog patch Paul saw images. The bus plunging over the cliff, the children screaming, water filling the ravine as they drowned in mud and rainwater. Their bodies never recovered, never properly buried, never allowed to rest. Paul huddled in the center of his cabin, clutching a fire poker, praying until his throat was raw. The children hammered on the walls, on the door, on every surface, the sound thunderous and rhythmic like a heartbeat. Hours passed. His mind began fracturing under the assault, and he found himself considering opening the door, letting them in, ending this terror. They'd been suffering for 65 years after all. Didn't they deserve peace? His hand was on the door handle when dawn broke. The hammering stopped instantly. Paul looked out to see the children backing away, their forms becoming translucent in the growing light. The little girl who'd spoken first looked up at him one last time. "You can't stay awake forever," she said with an adult's knowing tone. "We'll be back tonight and the next night and the next. Eventually you'll let us in. Everyone does." They faded into the forest as the sun rose. Paul immediately packed his essential gear and started hiking out, abandoning his post. He radioed in his resignation the moment he got signal, telling the Forestry Service there was a family emergency. He never mentioned the children. Who would believe him? He drove straight home, not stopping even for gas until he'd put 100 miles between himself and Cutter's Gorge. The Forestry Service sent another ranger, Marcus Webb, to relieve Paul's post. Marcus lasted 5 days before he abandoned the tower in the middle of the night, found the next morning wandering the highway in a state of shock, babbling about children who wanted to come inside. The next ranger, Sandra Kim, didn't even last 3 days. The tower was officially closed for structural concerns, though Paul knew the truth. Some places are haunted not by malevolence but by suffering so profound it can't dissipate. Only wait. Paul researched the 1952 accident thoroughly after his experience. He found photos of the children who died, 17 of them matching exactly what he'd seen. The bus had indeed gone over Cutter's Gorge during a flash flood, wedging in a crevasse where the ravine water rose and drowned them. Recovery efforts were abandoned after 2 weeks when more rain made the gorge impassable. The children's bodies remained down there still in that dark water, never given proper burial or peace. Sometimes Paul wakes at 2 a.m. to the sound of children singing. Though he lives 200 miles away now, he sees small handprints on his windows some mornings fading in the sunlight. He knows they haven't forgotten him, the man who refused to help them, who ran instead of offering comfort. The guilt eats at him alongside the fear. Those children have been cold and alone in that gorge for nearly 70 years, and they're still searching for someone to finally acknowledge their suffering, to finally let them come in from the dark. Paul just prays every night that he stays strong, enough to keep his doors locked, even as part of him whispers that maybe after all this time, those lost souls deserve whatever warmth they can find, no matter the cost. Story 36. The Broadcast from Nowhere. Kelly Martinez drove an ambulance for Lincoln County EMS in West Virginia, usually working day shifts. On December 9, 2019, she agreed to cover a night shift for a sick colleague, a decision she would forever regret. Around 1:30 a.m., Kelly and her partner James were parked at their station between calls, drinking coffee and monitoring the radio. The usual traffic came through: police calls, other EMS units, dispatch chatter. Then at 1:47 a.m. exactly, a new voice broke through. Unit requiring assistance on Greystone Pike, mile marker 47. Multiple casualties. Please respond immediately. The voice was female, calm and professional, but something about it sounded flat, emotionless in a way that made Kelly's nerves tingle. James grabbed the mic to confirm, but dispatch immediately responded saying they'd made no such call, there was no incident at that location, and asking what Kelly's unit was referencing. The voice came through again. Unit requiring assistance on Greystone Pike, mile marker 47, multiple casualties, time is critical. Kelly and James exchanged glances. Greystone Pike was an old mountain road, mostly abandoned since the new highway was built. But if someone needed help and had somehow accessed EMS frequencies, they couldn't ignore it. Against dispatch's instructions to stay put, Kelly started the ambulance and headed toward Greystone Pike. James tried to raise the mysterious caller again, asking for more details, but got no response, only that same message repeating every few minutes with robotic precision. The drive took 20 minutes. Greystone Pike was in terrible condition. Cracked asphalt overtaken by weeds, no streetlights, just their ambulance's headlights cutting through absolute darkness. Kelly found mile marker 47, a faded sign nearly invisible in the overgrowth. They slowed, scanning for any sign of an accident. Nothing. No vehicles, no debris, no people. The radio crackled. Unit requiring assistance on Greystone Pike, mile marker 47, multiple casualties. Why haven't you arrived? The voice's question changed everything. It was aware of them specifically, tracking their response. Kelly's hands tightened on the wheel. James, visibly nervous now, suggested they leave and report this to dispatch as a hoax. But as Kelly started to turn the ambulance around, their headlights swept across something at the roadside. A wooden sign, hand-painted, reading Greystone Medical Center, with an arrow pointing down a dirt-side road. Neither of them had ever heard of such a facility. "We should check it out," Kelly said, though every instinct screamed otherwise. They followed the dirt road for half a mile until a building emerged from the forest. An old hospital, 3 stories, windows dark, covered in decades of grime and ivy. The architecture was wrong for this region, too modern for when this area was settled, too decayed for modern construction. It simply shouldn't exist here. The radio voice came through again. "You've arrived. Please hurry. The patients are waiting." Kelly and James approached the building's entrance, their flashlights revealing double doors hanging open. Inside, the hospital was impossibly intact, despite obvious abandonment. Gurneys lined hallways, medical equipment sat gathering dust, paperwork scattered across nurses' stations. Everything looked paused, as if the staff had simply walked away mid-shift decades ago. Kelly picked up a chart. The date read, September 14th, 1967. She showed James, who'd found a newspaper in the waiting area with the same date. "Hello?" Kelly called out. Her voice echoed through empty corridors. The radio on her belt crackled. "Third floor, room 317. Please assist immediately." They found a stairwell, their footsteps echoing on concrete stairs. The hospital felt wrong in ways Kelly couldn't articulate. The proportions seemed off. Hallways stretched too long, rooms appeared larger on the inside than outside dimensions should allow. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and tasted of antiseptic mixed with decay. The third floor was worse. Every room's door stood open except one. 317. That door was closed and light showed underneath it, a flickering fluorescent glow. Kelly's hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. James grabbed her wrist. "We should leave," he whispered. "This is wrong. This whole place is wrong." But Kelly had been an EMT for 8 years, driven by a compulsion to help that overrode her fear. She opened the door. Room 317 was occupied. Hospital beds filled every available space, not the 5 or 6 that should fit, but dozens packed impossibly into the room, each containing a patient. Bodies in various states of injury and illness, some clearly dead, others moving slightly, all with the same date on their wristbands. September 14th, 1967. They turned their heads in unison as Kelly and James entered, dozens of eyes fixing on the paramedics with desperate, hungry expressions. One patient, a woman with severe burns covering half her body, sat up and pointed at them. "Fresh help," she rasped. "Finally, we've been waiting so long." The patients began climbing from their beds, moving with mechanical determination despite injuries that should have rendered them immobile. Kelly and James ran, the radio on Kelly's belt screaming static mixed with that calm voice. "Don't leave. The patients need assistance. You took an oath. Don't leave. Don't leave. Don't leave." They burst through the hospital's entrance and sprinted to their ambulance. Kelly's hands fumbled with keys as decayed hands began slapping against the ambulance's windows, leaving smears of something dark and viscous. The engine roared to life. Kelly floored it, the ambulance bouncing violently over the dirt road. In her rearview mirror, she saw the hospital patients flooding out of the building, dozens of them moving impossibly fast, pursuing the ambulance with inhuman speed. James was crying, praying, gripping the dashboard as Kelly pushed the vehicle to its limits. They reached Greystone Pike and didn't slow down until they'd driven 15 miles, finally stopping at a lit gas station where the ordinary world felt like salvation. They reported to dispatch, told their supervisor everything. The next day, a team went to investigate. They found mile marker 47, found where the dirt road should be, but there was no side road, no hospital, just unbroken forest. The sign Kelly and James swore they'd seen was gone. Ground-penetrating radar found nothing but trees and rock. Historical records showed no medical facility had ever existed in that area. The voice on the radio never came through again, at least not to any equipment being monitored. Kelly and James both requested transfers to day shifts exclusively. Kelly left EMS entirely 6 months later, unable to shake the nightmares. She'd researched September 14th, 1967, and found that date significant in local history. A terrible fire at a hospital in the next county over. Dozens killed, the facility completely destroyed. But that hospital had been 30 miles away from Greystone Pike, and its ruins were well documented. Whatever Kelly and James had found was something else, something wearing the memory of tragedy like a mask. She still hears that voice sometimes late at night when she's between sleep and waking. "Unit requiring assistance. Multiple casualties. Please respond. The patients are waiting." Kelly has learned to ignore it, to remind herself that some calls lead to places you can't come back from, that some patients died long ago and are best left unassisted. That whatever pretends to need help on Greystone Pike wants something far worse than emergency medical care. She keeps her radio off now, keeps all radios off because she knows if she answers again, the broadcast from nowhere will guide her back to that impossible hospital, where countless patients from 1967 are still waiting, still suffering, still hungry for the living to finally join them. Story number 7. The Thing in the Root Cellar. Ben and Ashley Hoffman bought their dream home in rural Kentucky just outside Hazard in May 2021. The farmhouse was over a century old, sitting on 40 acres of forest and fields, exactly what they'd wanted after years of city living in Louisville. The real estate agent mentioned a root cellar on the property, typical for houses of that era. She'd never been inside it, said the previous owners kept it locked. Ben and Ashley didn't think much of it during the purchase. Old cellars were common in Appalachian homes, usually just empty storage spaces. They moved in during summer, spending months renovating the main house. The root cellar could wait. It was a separate structure, built into a hillside about 50 yards from the house, with a heavy wooden door secured by a rusted padlock. In October, as they were finishing the main renovations and planning to tackle the cellar next, Ashley began hearing sounds at night. Scratching coming from outside. She'd wake around 3 a.m. to rhythmic scraping sounds like something dragging claws across wood or stone. Ben never heard it, slept soundly, and suggested it was probably raccoons or possums. But the sounds grew louder, more insistent. By late October, Ashley was losing sleep, lying awake listening to the scratching that seemed to be moving closer to the house each night. She started recording on her phone, capturing clear evidence of the sounds. Ben listened to the recordings and agreed something was out there, but his investigation of the property's perimeter found nothing. No animal tracks, no damage to the structures, no obvious source. On November 1st, Ashley noticed the root cellar's padlock was on the ground. The door stood slightly ajar. Ben swore he hadn't touched it, and they'd had no visitors. The lock probably just rusted through, he suggested, though it looked more like something had torn it free with considerable force. They decided to investigate the cellar together. Ben grabbed flashlights and a crowbar, half joking about expecting to find some animal had gotten inside. Ashley's dread was less humorous. The scratching sounds had stopped the same night the lock broke, and she knew somehow that these facts were connected. The cellar door groaned as Ben pulled it fully open. Stone steps descended into darkness, the air rushing out thick and foul, carrying the smell of earth and rot and something else. Something organic that had gone bad in a way that made Ashley gag. Ben descended first, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark. Ashley followed reluctantly, every nerve screaming to turn back. The cellar was larger than expected, probably 20 feet square, with stone walls and a dirt floor. Old shelves lined the walls, mostly empty except for a few ancient jars of preserved vegetables, their contents long spoiled. But in the back corner, they found something that stopped them cold. The dirt floor had been excavated, a pit dug roughly 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. Inside the pit were bones, not animal bones, but unmistakably human. A skull, ribs, long bones, all jumbled together and covered in strange markings, symbols carved directly into the bone tissue. Around the pit's edge, someone had drawn a circle using what looked like ash and salt, now broken and disturbed as if something had pushed through it from the inside. Ashley's flashlight revealed more details that made her blood freeze. On the cellar walls, hundreds of scratch marks gouged into the stone, concentrated heaviest around the door. Something had been trapped down here, trying desperately to get out, clawing at stone until its fingers, or whatever it used, left those permanent scars. And based on the scattered salt circle and the lock torn from outside, it had finally succeeded. Recently, right around the time Ashley's night sounds had begun. Ben wanted to call the police immediately, report the human remains. But Ashley noticed something else, a journal wrapped in plastic tucked into a gap between stones. She pulled it free and opened it, finding entries dated from 1923. The handwriting was frantic, difficult to read, but the message was clear. The house's original owner, Jeremiah Cutter, had done something terrible. Murdered a drifter in 1922, buried the body in the root cellar. But the dead man hadn't stayed dead, or something wearing his corpse had started moving, trying to claw its way out. Jeremiah had consulted with a local woman who knew the old ways, and together they'd performed a binding ritual, trapping whatever the dead man had become inside the cellar's walls with protective symbols and a sealed door. The journal's final entry was chilling. The binding will hold as long as the circle remains unbroken and the door stays locked. If something disturbs the circle, if the lock fails, the thing will get out. God help whoever lives here if that happens. It's hungry, so hungry, and it remembers what it's like to have flesh. It will try to remember by wearing someone else's. Ashley and Ben stood in the cellar, understanding dawning with horror. The scratching sounds hadn't been something trying to get into their house. It had been something studying them, learning their patterns, deciding which one of them would make the better fit. The flashlights flickered and died simultaneously. In the sudden darkness, they heard breathing that wasn't their own, coming from somewhere in the cellar with them. Something shifted in the dark, old bones scraping against stone. They ran. Ben shoved Ashley up the stairs first, then scrambled after her, slamming the cellar door shut behind them. But they both knew a door meant nothing to something that had already broken free. They ran to their house, locked every door and window, knowing logically that locks wouldn't help, but unable to stop the instinctive attempt at protection. They called the police, told a simplified story about finding human remains in their cellar. Officers came, investigated, removed the bones, and noted the situation for the county medical examiner. The police saw old remains and marks that could be explained by water damage and root growth. They saw nothing supernatural, filed a report about historical remains, and left Ben and Ashley alone with assurances that the bones would be properly handled. What they didn't see was the thing standing in the tree line, wearing the shape of a man but with proportions that weren't quite right, watching the house with patient hunger. Ashley saw it. She pointed, but by the time Ben looked, it had melted back into shadow. That night, the scratching returned, now against their bedroom window. Ben and Ashley huddled together, no longer skeptical, no longer able to pretend this was imagination or natural phenomena. They packed and left at dawn, abandoning the house they'd spent their savings to buy. They stayed with friends, put the property up for sale, and refused to discuss why they were leaving beyond vague references to discovering problems with the foundation. The house sold quickly to a young couple from Ohio who thought they'd gotten a bargain. Ben tried to warn them, but how do you explain something like that without sounding insane? 6 months later, he checked local news and found what he'd been dreading. The new owners had both disappeared. Police found the house empty. No signs of struggle, both cars still in the driveway, no indication of where they'd gone. Search parties found nothing. Ben knows what happened, knows that whatever lived in those bones found new vessels to wear, new flesh to remember sensation through. He still has nightmares about the scratching sounds, about that journal's warning, about the thing he briefly glimpsed in their flashlight beam before the batteries died. Something crouched and wrong, built from old bones and older hunger, wearing the memory of a man the way you might wear an uncomfortable coat. Sometimes Ben wakes at 3 a.m. to scratching sounds, even though they live in a 4th-floor apartment now, even though nothing could be outside their window. Ashley hears it too, and they hold each other in the dark, wondering if the thing in the root cellar is patient enough to track them, to wait for another opportunity, to remember what their flesh feels like so it can wear them properly the next time they meet. Story number 8. The Lights That Followed. Grace Palmer drove home from her waitress shift at a diner in Cumberland Gap, Tennessee on February 18, 2022. The route took her through sparsely populated mountain roads, a drive she'd made hundreds of times in the 3 years since moving to the area. Around 11 p.m., as she wound through a particularly isolated stretch, Grace noticed lights in her rearview mirror. Headlights following about a quarter-mile back, nothing unusual. She was relieved to have another driver on these lonely roads. But as miles passed, the lights maintained exactly the same distance. When Grace accelerated, they accelerated. When she slowed, they slowed, never getting closer or falling behind. It was eerie, but she tried to rationalize it. Maybe the other driver was using her taillights as a guide in the dark. Then she rounded a sharp curve where her line of sight should have broken, and when she checked her mirror, the lights were still there in the exact same position, despite the impossible geometry. They should have disappeared for several seconds. They hadn't. Grace's pulse quickened. She took a test, floored the accelerator, pushing her old Honda to 60 miles per hour on roads meant for 35. The lights in Almanont. Her mirror didn't change position at all, still maintaining that quarter-mile distance despite her increased speed. That was physically impossible. She slammed on her brakes, tires squealing, dropping to 20 miles per hour. The lights remained stationary in her mirror, unchanging. They weren't following the normal rules of distance and velocity. They were fixed relative to her somehow, like they weren't behind her at all, but attached to her somehow. The temperature in her car began dropping. Grace's breath fogged in air that had been comfortable moments before. Frost crept across the inside of her windows, crystalline patterns spreading in defiance of physics. Her radio started scanning through stations on its own, fragments of songs and voices mixing into a chaotic mess. Following you. Can't escape. Getting closer. Almost time. The lights in her mirror brightened, intensified, no longer resembling headlights but pure white radiance that hurt to look at. Grace took the next turn off the main road, hoping to lose whatever was following her. The side road was barely maintained, more dirt than pavement, climbing steeply into the mountains. Her headlights caught nothing but trees and darkness. She glanced in her mirror. The lights were still there, same distance, same intensity. She turned again, then again, taking random paths, trying to confuse or escape. Nothing changed. The lights followed, fixed in her mirror like a reflection that didn't correspond to anything real. Her car began struggling, the engine stuttering despite having a half tank of gas. The dashboard lights flickered. Grace's phone, sitting in the cup holder, went dark even though it had been at 60% battery. Everything electronic was failing, drained by some presence she couldn't understand. The lights behind her grew brighter still, and now Grace could see something else in their glow. A silhouette, a figure standing in the light, arms spread wide, head tilted at an angle that made her stomach lurch. The figure moved closer in her mirror, defying the fixed distance the lights had maintained. It walked through the luminescence, becoming more defined, impossibly tall, with limbs too long and joints that bent in too many places. Its face, when Grace finally saw it clearly, was her own face, but stretched and wrong, like a mask made from a photograph and pulled tight over something with a different skull structure. The thing wearing her face smiled, and Grace screamed. Her car died completely, coasting to a stop in the middle of nowhere. The lights surrounded her vehicle now, no longer behind but on all sides, pressing against the windows. The figure, the thing with her stolen face, pressed its hands against the glass, leaving prints that glowed with cold fire. Grace fumbled for her door handle, some desperate instinct driving her to run into the forest, to take her chances with the mountains rather than stay trapped with this thing. But the doors wouldn't open, sealed by some force that had nothing to do with locks. The creature spoke, and its voice was Grace's voice, layered and echoing. I've been looking for you for so long. Do you know how hard it is existing between moments, seeing everyone but touching no one? You slowed down at that crossroads 3 years ago, hesitated when the light turned green, and in that hesitation you touched my world. You became visible to me, and I've been reaching for you ever since, following your light through the dark, waiting for the perfect moment to make contact. Grace couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Terror so complete it bordered on paralysis. The creature's smile widened impossibly. "Don't be afraid," it whispered with her voice. "This is a gift. You'll become like me, existing in the spaces between. You'll see everyone but touch no one. You'll follow other lights, other lives, forever watching, forever separate. It's so lonely here. I need company. I need you." The lights flared, bright enough to blind, and Grace felt something reaching through the glass, through the metal and plastic of her car, reaching into her chest. Cold fingers wrapped around her heart, beginning to pull. She was being dragged sideways through reality, tugged toward the place where the creature lived, the space between moments where things that almost existed dwelled in frozen hunger. She fought it, screaming prayers her grandmother taught her, focusing on memories of warmth and light and human connection, anchoring herself to the solid world with everything she had. The creature hissed, its stolen face contorting. "You can't resist forever. Every time you drive at night, I'll be in your mirror. Every shadow, every reflection, I'll be reaching. You've been marked, touched by the in-between. Someday your will falter, and I'll be waiting." The lights retreated suddenly. Grace's car systems flickered back to life. Her engine started, headlights returning, phone glowing as it rebooted. She sobbed with relief, immediately driving away, not caring about direction, just needing to move. She found a main highway eventually, followed it to the nearest town, and checked into a motel. Grace didn't return to her apartment that night or the next. She eventually went back with friends during daylight, packed her essentials, broke her lease, and moved in with family in Knoxville. She sold her car, couldn't stand to sit in it after what happened. She avoids driving at night entirely now, takes buses or ride shares after dark, never wanting to be alone on dark roads again. But the creature kept its promise. Grace sees it in mirrors sometimes, standing behind her reflection, arms spread, wearing her face like a trophy. She sees it in shop windows at dusk, in the black screen of her phone when it's off, in any reflective surface when the light is dim. It's patient, waiting, following the mark it left on her that February night. Sometimes Grace wakes at 3 a.m. feeling cold fingers around her heart, feeling herself being pulled sideways, fighting to stay anchored in the real world. She knows that eventually, if she ever lets her guard down completely, if she ever relaxes her grip on reality, the creature will finish what it started and pull her into the space between moments, where she'll exist forever as it does. Alone, hungry, following lights in the dark and reaching desperately for human contact she can never quite grasp. Forever trapped in the in-between where nothing is real, but nothing ever truly ends. Story number 9, The Last House on Redbone Ridge. Matthew Cole worked for the county power company in eastern Tennessee, maintaining electrical infrastructure across hundreds of miles of rural territory. On October 31, 2020, Halloween night, Matthew received a call about a power outage affecting a single residence on Redbone Ridge. The work order seemed strange. He didn't recall any houses that far up the ridge, but the address was in the system and someone had reported the outage, so he drove out despite the late hour. The road to Redbone Ridge deteriorated from pavement to gravel to barely maintained dirt track. Matthew's truck climbed steadily into the mountains, his GPS insisting he was on the right path even though he'd never been called to this location before. After 45 minutes, his headlights caught a mailbox marked with the address he'd been given. A driveway branched off into the forest, and at its end, he found the house. It was old, Victorian style, completely out of place in these mountains where most homes were simple farmhouses or modern cabins. This structure belonged in a different era, perhaps a different region entirely, with elaborate trim and a wraparound porch that suggested wealth and care. Lights glowed in the windows, warm, inviting, strangely comforting. Matthew checked his work order, confused. The report said the power was out, but clearly the house had electricity. Maybe the outage had already been fixed, or maybe there'd been a mistake. He knocked on the front door anyway, professional courtesy dictating he confirm the situation before leaving. The door opened immediately as if someone had been waiting right behind it. A woman stood there, perhaps in her 50s, wearing a dress that looked like something from the 1950s. She smiled warmly. "Thank goodness you're here," she said. "We've been waiting so long for someone from the power company. Please, come in where it's warm." Matthew hesitated. Something felt off, though he couldn't articulate what. But the woman seemed genuinely grateful, and he was just doing his job. He stepped inside. The interior matched the exterior's period styling. Antique furniture, floral wallpaper, photographs in ornate frames. A dozen people occupied the living room, all dressed in clothing decades out of fashion, all turning to look at Matthew with expressions of intense relief. An older man stood, hand extended. "Welcome, son. We're so glad you could make it. We were afraid we'd spend another Halloween alone." Matthew shook the man's hand reflexively, noting how cold the skin felt despite the house's warmth. "I'm just here to check the power situation," he said, unease growing. "Your lights seem fine, though. Is there a specific issue you're experiencing?" The room full of people laughed, a sound that held strange echoes, like each laugh was layered with dozens more underneath. The woman who'd answered the door touched Matthew's arm gently. "The power has been out for a very long time," she said. "Since 1963, to be exact. We've been waiting for someone to restore it." 1963, that was impossible. The work order had come through tonight. Matthew tried to step back toward the door, but found his exit blocked by more people who'd moved behind him silently. They all watched him with the same hungry expression, pale faces too still, eyes reflecting lamplight like animals' eyes. "I think there's been a mistake," Matthew said, voice shaking. "I should go. I'll have the office send someone else." "You're exactly who we need," the old man said, his smile widening to show too many teeth. "Do you know what happened here, Matthew? How we ended up trapped?" Matthew hadn't told them his name. "This house was struck by lightning in October 1963 during a Halloween party. The surge came through the electrical system, caught the wiring, and burned us all alive while we celebrated. 17 people died here, Matthew. 17 people who never got to finish their evening, who never got to leave." The room's occupants closed in slowly, their movements synchronized in a way that made Matthew's skin crawl. "We've been here ever since," the woman continued. "Trapped in this house, unable to move on, waiting for someone to finish what the lightning started. We need a connection, you see. A conduit. Someone living to channel the power properly, to complete the circuit that was interrupted when we died." Matthew lunged for the door, but hands grabbed him. So many hands, cold and strong, pulling him back into the living room's center. He struggled, but there were too many of them, and they possessed a strength that shouldn't exist in form so obviously unalive. They pressed him into an antique chair, holding him there while the old man approached carrying something. A length of copper wire, twisted and blackened, salvaged from the house's original electrical system. "This won't hurt for long," the man said almost kindly. "You'll become part of the circuit, part of the house, part of us. We've been so lonely here, Matthew. 17 people trapped in a moment of death, replaying our Halloween party for 57 years, unable to move forward or fade away. Your living energy will complete what needs completing. You'll help us finally leave, and in exchange, you'll take our place. One living soul can anchor many dead ones, you see. Fair trade." They wrapped the wire around Matthew's wrists, around his chest, chanting something in unison. Words that hurt to hear, syllables that shouldn't fit together, a language of electricity and death. The lights in the house began flickering. Power surged through the wiring, through the copper touching Matthew's skin. Pain exploded through his body, every nerve ending screaming as voltage he shouldn't be able to survive coursed through him. He smelled burning flesh, his own, and through his agony heard the dead people laughing, crying, thanking him. The house shook. Reality bent around the electrical surge. Matthew felt himself being anchored, tied to this location by forces he couldn't comprehend, becoming part of the circuit that would feed these spirits forever. But in his pain and terror, something his grandmother once told him surfaced. On Halloween, the veil is thin both ways. Dead can touch living, but living can touch dead. If you're strong enough, you can push back. Matthew focused through the pain, gathered every ounce of will he possessed and pushed. Not physically, but with something deeper. His life force, his existence, his refusal to become food for ghosts. He pushed against the wire binding him, against the spirits holding him, against the house itself. The lights flared brilliantly, then exploded. Every bulb in the house burst simultaneously. The surge reversed, flowing back through the dead people instead of through Matthew, completing the circuit they'd sought in a way they hadn't anticipated. The spirits screamed, finally feeling the death they'd been insulated from for 57 years. They burned again properly this time, consumed by electrical fire that existed on a metaphysical level, turning them to ash and memory. Matthew fell from the chair as their grips released, hitting the floor hard. The house groaned, its timbers cracking, the structure beginning to collapse now that the spirits anchoring it to existence were gone. Matthew crawled, then ran, stumbling through a doorway as the house folded in on itself behind him. He made it to his truck, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove away from Redbone Ridge as fast as the treacherous roads allowed. When he glanced in his rearview mirror, he saw flames. The house burning, finally completing the destruction the lightning had started in 1963, consuming everything that should have been ash decades ago. He reported to his supervisor the next day, claiming he'd found no house at that address, must have gotten confused in the dark. He never mentioned the spirits, the wire, the burning. When he looked up historical records, he found articles about the lightning strike at a Redbone Ridge residence in October 1963, about 17 people killed during a Halloween party, about the house burning to its foundation. According to all documentation, that house had been gone for 57 years. What Matthew had visited existed somewhere else, some echo or shadow persisting despite physical destruction. The burns on his wrists and chest are permanent, faint scars from copper wire that shouldn't have touched him in a house that shouldn't exist. Matthew transferred to day shifts exclusively, refuses calls to remote locations, and never works on Halloween. Sometimes he dreams of that living room, of hands holding him, of voices thanking him for his sacrifice. He wakes screaming, checking his body for wires he knows aren't there. The power company's records still show that work order, still list that address as an active service location, and every few months, someone gets sent up Redbone Ridge to check on an outage. Matthew always volunteers to take their shift, to keep anyone else from finding what he found. Because he knows that houses fueled by death don't just disappear, they wait, and somewhere up on that ridge, 17 spirits are still searching for a conduit, still throwing out calls for help, still hoping to trap some living soul in copper wire and finish the terrible work the lightning began so many Halloweens ago.